pecuniary interest. And if I can't see you, I need you to key your mics, please. Okay, seeing, hearing none. Moving on to delegations, presentations to public meetings. We have one presentation, 3.1, asset management proposals, proposed levels of service information session. Graham Wilson, Supervisor of Asset Management. Whenever you're ready, please.
Good morning, Mayor and Council, ladies and gentlemen. This is just an information session on the proposed level of service as part of the OREG 58817. It's a collaborative effort from all the different service areas within the town, as well as the Corporate Asset Management Steering Committee, which is made up of Dave Meredith, Diane Valentin, Julie Meffam, Renal Fernando, Michael Chi, Kevin Douglas, and myself. At any point in time during this presentation, please interrupt us. If you have questions on sheet 2, this presentation builds upon itself, and you'll definitely have questions on sheet 22 if you don't ask questions before. No questions now. So the proposed level of service is part of this plan needs to be adopted by council before the July 1st, 2025 deadline, as per the OREG 58817. So this is just introducing those to you. If you have any questions, concerns, suggestions to us, please provide those before April 4th, which is a Friday, and we'll incorporate those into the asset management plan. All right, thank you. And Kevin, I'll call upon Kevin Douglas, please.
All right, so for the agenda today, we'll give you guys an introduction and project background, and then we'll give you a summary of outputs of the asset management plan, and then some closing remarks, and obviously some time for a discussion afterwards if you guys have any questions and whatnot. So we'll jump right into it. So this is the asset management plan update council education session. So as Graham already mentioned, the next version of the asset management plan is required to be approved by council by July 1st of 2025 per the regulation. Aside from the fact that this is a really good planning document, one of the main reasons this is so important is there are various grants as well as the Canada Community Building Funding, formerly called the gas tax, are conditional upon meeting the legislative requirements. So there are millions of dollars at stake, which is why it's very important that we meet these deadlines. And I think it's also important to note that the next iteration of the asset management plan is running concurrently with the update of the town's financial sustainability plan, or FSP. So a lot of the information that you guys are approving for proposed levels of service are going to directly feed into the FSP, and that is being brought forward to council in September of 2025. So this is just a quick run through of the different milestones that we've hit to this point. So in July of 2019, we got the strategic asset management policy approved. In July of 2022, we did our current levels of service for our core assets. So when we're saying core assets, we're referring to our stormwater, our roads, and our bridges and major culverts. And then last year, if you guys remember, back in, I believe it was June of 2024, we brought forward the asset management plan for non-core assets, which is basically all assets other than the core assets across the town of Ajax. And so for this iteration of the plan, we're required to document the proposed levels of service and the cost to achieve those proposed levels of service, at least for the next 10 years, as well as a funding strategy. And we'll walk through this as we go through the plan here today. So I think this slide gives you a pretty good idea of, we've broken the asset management plan down into 8 different service levels or service areas. And as you can see, so the first 3 in this chart, so transportation, environmental, and facilities, they make up about 94% of our total asset value. So while we will go through each of these service areas, I think it's really important to keep in mind that the majority of our asset value resides in those first 3, and that's really where we're going to focus on proposed levels of service, and where we're really recommending some changes, specifically to roads. So stay tuned for that. Graham will go through that a little bit later in the presentation. So this slide gives you an idea of the state of infrastructure as of the end of 2024. So we met with all of the different service areas across the town, and they updated their inventory since the last iteration of the asset management plan. They gave us, their best estimate of what condition is as of the end of 2024, as well as all the assets that they are currently responsible for. So as you can see, we're doing pretty good right now. About 92% of the town's assets are in fair or better condition. I will just say, the town is a fairly young town, and as you'll see later on in this presentation, it might not be realistic to maintain this quality of assets given our current funding. So I think it's a good news story, but I think it's important to keep that in mind as we roll through this presentation. And on the other hand, we only have about 1% that are in very poor condition. So overall, I think kudos to you guys. We're doing a pretty good job at this point in time. This slide basically shows the same thing as the last slide, but it just puts everything to scale. Lets you see a perspective just how small some of those other areas are. So if we look at the risk management strategy, I apologize, I'm kind of losing my voice, so bear with me. But what this slide shows is the likelihood of failure. So that's really the condition of the assets. So depending on the condition, if it's in very poor condition, it has almost a certain likelihood of failure. But when we're looking at prioritizing what assets we need to replace or renew, we should also be looking at the consequence of failure. And so some examples of the very high-risk assets that you're seeing in that very high red top right category of the matrix, those would include fire vehicles, some equipment, IT server equipment that's a little bit older, some of our stormwater ponds that are in pretty poor condition at this point and probably require clean out, as well as some of the critical facility components. So I think as we mature through this asset management journey, the goal of finance and all the departments really is to, I know we have a limited amount of funding, and so we have to look at where we get the biggest bang for our buck and be able to limit the risk exposure that the town of Ajax is facing. So that's really the purpose of showing this slide.
Does anybody have any questions at this point?
Okay, so for this slide, I'm going to take a little bit of time on this slide because I know there are a lot of graphs in this presentation, and so it's really important that council understands what it is that this represents. So what you see here is over the next 10 years, these are the expenses that we would estimate based on the asset management model that we've put together. This would be the cost per year broken down between the non-core renewal needs, which is the dark blue, and then the core renewal needs, which is the light blue. So again, the core renewal needs are our roads, our stormwater, our bridges, and our major culverts. So the next line that you see here, this dotted line that just popped up, that is the 10-year average annual renewal need. So it's at about $29.6 million per year. So if we were to maintain current levels of service, and we're only talking about the asset management portion of our capital budget, we're not talking about growth or adding any assets, we're saying on average we would need about almost $30 million per year. Now, I think, again, I go back to what I said, where the town of Ajax is a relatively young municipality. We've had a ton of growth over the last couple decades. And so a lot of the large infrastructure projects, like roads reconstructions, like replacement of our storm sewer system, that are gonna see huge spikes in the capital budget, we're not expecting to see a lot of that in the next 10 years, right? So it's not reflected in this. But we will see those projects come, 30, 40, 50, 60 years down the line. And so this green line that just popped up on the screen, that's really what is represented by that green line. So yeah, maybe over the next 10 years, we're not gonna see those projects, just given that we're in pretty good shape right now. But later on, we are going to come to a point where we need to be saving. Right now, we theoretically should be saving about $57.3 million per year, which is represented by that green line, which is, as you can see by the red line, we're nowhere close to that right now. We're currently funding our asset management capital plan at about $21.5 million per year. So if you compare that red line to the dotted black line, that's an infrastructure gap of about $8.1 million per year. And then if you compare it to the green line, that's a gap of about $35.8 million per year. So again, we might not see those costs over the next 10 years, but we are going to see them later on. And that's really where I think it's important that council and the public understands we're trying to create some intergenerational equity. We don't want to burden future generations of Ajax by not saving now and making sure that we're building our reserves so that we can pay for those projects later on down the line. So what you see now that popped up on the screen is the yellow line. And so what that represents is, I know in theory, council has endorsed an infrastructure levy of about 2% until 2026 and then 1% thereafter. So that's really what you're seeing for that yellow line. So as you can see, if council was to continue on with this approach, and I think kudos to you guys, you've already implemented this for the last few years, and you've understood that it's important and that you're making the right decisions. But as you can see, we start to get a little bit closer to being able to maintain service levels over the next 10 years. And obviously, we're still far away from that green line, but it's at least headed in the right direction. And so if you look at the next 10 years, if we were to maintain levels of service and you guys were to approve that 1% infrastructure levy after 2026, we would see an infrastructure gap on average of about $2.5 million per year.
In your studies, though, has anybody ever hit the green line? Like any municipality, that's like, it's so ambitious, but I can't imagine any, even like Toronto is nowhere close to that green line. So I think I understand the point you're making, but it is way beyond practical, right? In real dollars and cents?
Yeah, I mean, it's through the chair, it's a good point.
It's aspirational, I guess.
It's aspirational.
Sure. Okay.
I think what we're trying to convey is you guys have made the right decisions to this point, right? And yeah, to your point, Councillor Lee, if you look at, there was an article that the City of Toronto, it was in the CBC, but the City of Toronto, I think, for their non-core assets, so we're not even talking about their roads and wastewater and water, they were forecasting a $26 billion infrastructure gap to maintain current levels of service. So yes, I think, if you're comparing us to some of these other older municipalities, we're in pretty good shape, but I think we want to be able to, continue down this approach. Are there any other questions? No?
Hi, thank you, Deputy Mayor, Chair, and thank you for this presentation. So just so I'm straight. So when you said a 1% infrastructure levy, that 1%, what does it mean? Like 1% more that you need or 1% you're saying on our tax bill, Ms. Valentin, right? Is that how that would work?
Through the chair, yes. So we've been implementing a 2% infrastructure levy. So yes, it's built into your tax increase annually.
So we're at 2% for, say, 22 and 23 and 24 years.
Correct.
And now you're suggesting, or they're suggesting that we go to 3%?
No.
Down
the
to
chair.
1%?
We had identified a 2% annual levy until 2026 and then 1% thereafter.
Oh, so after 2026, it would go down to 1%?
1%. That's what we had brought forward to council before, yes.
It's got to be the first time ever. Okay. Thank you.
All right, so I'll continue.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, okay. I don't know who's controlling the mic. Through the chair, so just to go back at these numbers that you gave out here, and hopefully I typed fast enough. You said 57.3 million needed for the future? Was that the correct number?
Yeah, so that what that green line represents is if you were to save enough, so if you looked at all of your assets and you looked at what the annual need would be for those assets, theoretically, what you should be saving each year to ensure that you're fully funded to replace those in order to maintain levels of service, you theoretically should be funding your asset management capital needs at an average of $57.3 million per year.
Yeah, I'm seeing it. Yeah, I'm seeing it there. But and you're saying, when you're saying funding, you're saying getting the funding through what source? I just want to be clear, not from the tax levy. Yes?
I mean, so we're not necessarily recommending that we hit this line, but it could be any, so I mean, there are multiple options, and actually in one of the later slides, we'll go through some of those options. And as part of the FSP, we'll get a little bit more in depth in terms of how we would recommend funding it. But we're kind of showing that by that yellow line, that would be what we've kind of identified from a tax-based funding, but there are other options available. We could fund from debt. We could fund from increasing user fees. There are multiple options.
Or we could pull back on projects,
Correct.
correct?
But that's also decreasing levels of service.
Pardon me?
That is decreasing levels of service.
Capital
If you-
projects.
If you wish to do that.
If you pulled back on capital projects, you could still have a similar amount by pulling back on some projects? Like, is what you're saying is the only way to get the money that's needed is to increase the tax amount, increase the service user fee amount? Is that what you're saying?
Or decrease levels of service.
Or decrease levels of service? Okay.
Councillor Henry,
Yeah, yes.
this is going to be up to council to establish what level of service we want to provide, and we will decide at that time, usually through budget, usually through the treasurer, on how we are going to fund these, and what projects we're going to maintain now and any that we're going to defer. So that will come at later, those decisions.
I understand, Mayor, the decisions will come later. I'm just asking what the proposed methods of achieving this goal is, just so I'm clear. Thank you.
Councillor Crawford, you are next.
The infrastructure levy that we implemented 2 years ago,
Through the chair, I think it was 2022 that we
2022,
implemented it.
was specifically for this, right? So we have been saving all along because of that infrastructure levy. The other piece, the other source is the gas tax funding, right? Or whatever we call it now, the really long name that,
Through the chair, is
Canada
CCBF, Canada
Infrastructure-
Community Benefit Fund.
yeah.
We do use some of the funding to support our capital infrastructure. We also right now have slots revenue that comes in Casino Ajax, as well as our Lexicon revenue that helps support our capital program.
Right, so that is non-taxable revenue that will support the asset plan, the asset management plan, correct?
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, and just to add to that through the chair, that red line that you see, it does include the gas tax funding that we estimate over the next 10 years. It's included in that base funding. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, all good questions. And hopefully we address some of them as we move through the project, or through the presentation. Okay, so so what this graph is showing is if we were to maintain current levels of service based on those needs that you saw on the last graph, that's kind of the condition profile that you'd see over the next 10 years. So I mean, like, there is a little bit of a shift, but for the most part, we're trying to keep, like, you know, the poor and very poor fairly consistent throughout the next 10 years. So I know you guys have already asked some questions on this, and again, the mayor made a good point that ultimately it is council's decision on how we go about funding this and what the proposed levels of service are, but some of the options for closing the infrastructure gap. So again, we can increase revenues. So we've already committed to infrastructure levy up to this point. You know, obviously we'll try to take advantage of any grants and other revenue sources where we can. We could increase user fees or rates. We could also look at debt capacity and reserves, so debenture funding and reserve management. And as I mentioned before, we're working on the FSP, so we'll have some more recommendations come out of that. On the flip side, if we're looking at expenditures, we could look to reduce expenditures. So we could defer renewals, prioritize renewals based on risk exposure. So Graham's gonna take over after I'm finished here, and he's gonna kind of walk you through what we're proposing in terms of deferring some renewals where we think there's an acceptable amount of risk. We can reduce service levels or adjust as appropriate, minimize the size of the asset portfolio associated with the operating and renewal needs. And then obviously we could also look at exploring opportunities for more efficient and cost-effective service delivery, which I think we do a good job through the annual budget process. So with that being said, I'll hand it over to Graham to start walking you through our proposed levels of service.
Just one sec. We do have a question. Councillor Bauer.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor Collier. Good morning. Thank you for the presentation so far. Lots of slides and graphs. I did notice one of the choices on these graphs or explanations is unknown condition. So I wanted to ask, what would be, how would we end up with something that we would have an unknown condition for? Do we have that in the town currently? And what would you say the value of those unknown conditions? I guess you can really note the value, but can you comment on to why we would have unknown conditions?
So I think I'll just go to the slide that actually shows you. So if you look here, you can see the unknown. Actually, I don't know if people online can see that.
Okay, there it is.
Yeah,
in
okay.
fire.
So $2.2 million is assessed as unknown condition. So I think the majority of that is, so if you look at street lights and street poles, so a lot of our data is pulled out of GIS, and some of the data is not great, let's say. So we might know that there's a street light and a street pole and a luminaire in that specific location. We have no idea when it was installed, and we haven't actually sent someone out to do a condition assessment on it. So in that instance, we know the asset's there. We know that we need to consider it from a funding standpoint, but we just don't know what the condition is at this point. We can't make an age-based assumption, and nobody's actually gone out and done a physical inspection of it. So there are some assets like that. And like it's similar with fire. I think it's safe to say that a lot of the fire assets are probably in good or better condition, but just the data that we were working with, we weren't able to come up with something that was accurate enough that we could support, so that's why it's showing as unknown. But again, it's a relatively small portion of the overall asset base.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for pulling up this slide. I knew I saw it. I couldn't find it as you were speaking. I just thought it was of note because fire is listed as very high risk asset on that one slide that you showed us. So I thought it was to note that the chunk of the unknown condition is listed under a column called fire. So, and is there a plan in place? We haven't been able to look at those or monitor the conditions. Is that part of this plan to actually do that at some point?
Through the chair to Councillor Bowyer, yes, we will do updating the conditions of all these assets that are unknown at this current time. Not before July,
Okay,
but going forward.
all right, okay, thank you.
But with respect to fire, there are acts in place, there's legislation that firefighters cannot be using assets that are not in good or better condition.
Of course, absolutely, and we wouldn't want them to be. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mayor Collier, those are my questions.
So I'd like to talk about transportation. The core assets are the roads, the bridges, and the culverts. Then the non-core is everything else with the streetlights, the sidewalks, the parking lots, the guide rails, retaining walls, acoustic barriers, and cycle lanes. So the road conditions. When I came to Ajax, I was like, wow, the roads are in really good shape. I came from a municipality to the east, and I came here, and I was like, wow. But Ajax is a little bit newer than Whitby was. And that's to be seen, but I live east of here, so. So with respect to the conditions, we've got roads that are very good condition, where you have minor cracking. We've got assets that are roads that are in good condition, where you have small cracks, and they're preventative maintenance, such as crack sealing and maybe some patching work that could be done there. Road conditions that are fair. So the PQI range there are like 40 to 60. So we'll keep that in mind, because in a minute we'll see that. We have moderate cracks and settlement around maintenance holes and catch basins. Then we get to poor in 20 to 40 PQI. We've got settlement around curbs. There's maintenance holes and curbs settlement, and moderate to severe cracking, rutting, and potholes may exist. And very poor, we don't want the assets to get to this point where the PQI is 0 to 20, and you got severe cracking, and the surface is compromised by cracking throughout and severe rutting. So we talked about road triggers. So there's different types of roads within the town. So we'll deal with Bs and C arterials the same. So currently the trigger points are 60 and 55 respectively. We're proposing to drop those down to 55. And you look further on, and the savings per lane kilometer is about 220,000. We've got about 43 lane kilometers, so that's about $9.5 million over the life cycle of that asset, or that group of assets. You got collectors. The current trigger point is 50, where we do something, whether we do a resurfacing, like a shave and pave, like one lift of asphalt, or do 2 lifts of asphalt. And we're proposing to drop that to 45. We save about $300,000 over the life of that asset, the 90 years. We got about 90 kilometers, so we save about $28 million. In local, the current trigger point is 45. We propose to drop that down to 35, which is just into the poor section of the condition of these roads. And the savings per lane kilometer over the life of those assets is about 140,000. So we're saving about 72 million. So overall, it's about $110 million savings. Any questions here?
I do, and then I do have a small speakers list. How can you call this savings when all we really are doing is deferring it till later? From what I see.
Well, we're not doing things as frequently. So maybe savings is the wrong word.
Okay, let me rephrase. I know that if you catch a road at a certain stage and you can do a shave and pave, for instance, it is a significant reduction than what it would cost to let it go further and then have to completely go from the granulars up and redo the entire road. So what you're suggesting is we lower the trigger point, so we let the road get to a more degraded condition before we take action. And yeah, you're referring it to savings. I don't see it as savings. I see it as just deferring the payment for a couple more years. However, it could potentially cost us more money after. That's my question, is how is that savings?
Through the chair to Mayor Collier, the current costs of doing a shave and pave is 80% of the cost of doing a full depth resurfacing. So if you're doing something at year 20, you're doing a shave and pave, and you're spending 80% of what you would do at years 30 or 35 doing a full depth resurfacing, we're deferring things later on, but we are saving money as well, in my opinion.
I didn't realize that shave and pave was 80%. I thought it was significantly less. Next question, though, is especially in the last 3-4 years since COVID, our costs have gone up significantly to do roadworks. So by pushing something off 4 or 5 years again, wouldn't the cost to do it at that point, or wouldn't you expect them to be quite a bit higher?
Well, CPI affects everything, right? But inflation affects things. You know, if we wait 5 years, we'll have more money through taxes to pay for that through the inflationary periods.
Okay, but the costs I'm talking about far exceed CPI, or MPI is what we use. So I do agree, and I'd rather not use the taxes. I'd rather hope for better returns through our investment strategy, which I think we're getting, to help not have to go back to the taxpayer. I'm just seeing a very difficult situation coming. I see CEO Baker. Shane, go ahead.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Maybe I can put it from a different perspective. My understanding, and I'll allow staff to respond here, but my understanding as it was presented to us, it's if you think about how often you need to change the oil in your car. So if you're changing the oil in your car every 5,000 kilometers, but you really don't need to change it until every 7,000 kilometers, then you are spending more money than you need to maintain that car. It was my understanding that we are maintaining the roads at a very high level when we don't need to. Now, and I'll let staff respond to this, but I don't believe that it's the case that by reducing the level of service slightly, because all of our roads are maintained at a very high level right now. If we maintain them at slightly lower level, we would save the money because we're not maintaining on such a frequent basis. Am I getting that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you. Councilor Bauer, you are next.
Thank you, Mayor Collier. And most of my questions have been answered through the mayor's questions. What does PQI stand for?
Pavement Quality Index.
Thank you. Okay. So, and I guess just as a clarification, so this would be considered a reduction in level of service, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And then that stretches out the amount of time between maintenance on our roads. And we do have a very high maintenance quality now. Do you expect, and I think the mayor asked this question, but maybe I didn't get it. Do you expect that if we delay that timing by this much of a trigger amount, that it will be more expensive because the degradation will be just that much higher?
There's estimates from the Operations Services Division of Roads that it increased about 10% to the road maintenance. So it's about $15,000 per year.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Mayor.
Any more questions?
Oh, thank you.
Councilor Henry, you're next.
Thank you, through the chair. So my concern here is when I'm looking at local roads and going from a 45 to a 30, And when we drop below 40, we're in the poor zone here of the road condition. And I've been in municipalities to the east where the road condition is poor, and it is not fun to drive on. It is not good wear and tear for the vehicles. So I can see where you're going and reasonably okay with everything above local roads. But once we start dropping into the poor zone, I think we're going into a level of service that Ajaxians are not used to and might not be accepting of. Those are my concerns. Would you have anything to say with regards to that?
We're just proposing changes to level of service here. It's ultimately up to you to determine if these levels of service are acceptable, for one, and determining how you're going to pay for the level of service. Second, like this is an Ontario regulation that's come forth from the Ontario government, and they require that we show some sort of balance of expenditures to funding. So if the town's roads are to be kept in a fair to good condition, irrespective of what their functional class is, it's going to cost the town. Like we haven't got onto the next slides to show that how this affects the level of service and the condition of those assets and the funding requirements of those assets. So they're to come further on. You've probably seen them over the weekend.
I'll let you continue with your presentation, but I just wanted to make that comment that for me personally, I feel like that is the one category where I never want to fall into is the poor quality from 20 to 40 PQI. That's the one category on this whole chart that really does make me concerned. So I'll let you continue with your presentation. Thank you.
Oh, further that, through the chair to Councillor Henry. My street that I live on was resurfaced in 2014, but it was built in 1979. So 35 years between the time that it was built to the time it was resurfaced. And it was in that 20 to 40 category, but it probably still had 4 or 5 years life left in it. I don't want to see life of pavement and life of roads being ground up. You know, not, you know, like and wasting money in the case of keeping things in fair condition where the life of these assets still have time, you know, before they need to be replaced.
Okay, Council, we are on slide 16 of 51. So may I suggest that we hold some of our questions, as the presenter has said, some of your questions might be answered in future slides, get through the presentation, then open up for questions, please. So let's continue with the presentation and we'll get to the questions after. Thank you.
So currently, right now, to maintain the level of service over the life cycle of the average annual requirements for the life of that asset, we're spending $22.1 million. The 10-year average annual requirement is $14.7 million. And we're currently funding at $6 million. So there's, between the 10-year, there's an $8 million gap. And between, like there's an infrastructure gap of $16.1 million over the life of that asset. So the proposed level of service that we're proposing here drops that 10-year average annual need down to $9 million. Drops the average life of the average annual life cycle requirement over the life cycle of that asset to $17.9 million. So the 10-year infrastructure gap is $3 million. And the infrastructure gap between the funding and the requirement for the life of that asset is $11.9 million. So with regards to the condition, it stays relatively consistent. There are some more assets in poor condition by the end of that 10-year forecast. But there are poor assets throughout with regards to maintaining the level of service and the proposed level of service. So this is all assets. This includes roads as well as the street lights, the guide rails and such. So over the maintain, the average life cycle annual requirement need is $32.1 million. The 10-year expenditure, the average annual expenditure is $16.9 million. And we're currently funding at $8.2 million. So there's about $24 million infrastructure gap between what we're funding and what we need to fund for the life cycle of that asset. So under the proposed level of service, that life cycle average annual requirement need drops to $27 million. The 10-year average annual requirement drops to $11.2 million, and the funding stays at $8.2 million. So we're still shy by $3 million for the 10 years and approximately $19 million for the life of that asset. So with regards to environmental, we got the stormwater, the core are the mainline pipes and the feeds, as well as the stormwater management ponds, as well as forestry, whether they're boulevard park trees and woodlots. There's no change in the level of service here. We're maintaining the level of service and the proposed level of service are equal. The average annual funding and the 10-year requirement is 2.1 and 2.2 respectively. So they're equal. We'll call it equal. But the life cycle of these assets are $6.3 million. So you got stormwater management main lines that are in the ground. We don't see them until there's a problem. Now 90 years later, and we need to spend a lot of money to reconstruct the roads and redo those main lines of storm sewers. But the condition of the assets stay the same throughout the 10 years because of those long-lived assets, for the most part, that are the storm lines. They're expensive.
Okay, so I'll walk you guys through the facilities proposed levels of service. So again, the facilities hierarchy, it includes all facilities. So I just want to make it clear to everybody that when we're talking about, fire assets, it excludes fire stations, and same with library. All the facility-related components are included in this service area. So what we're showing right now is basically the maintain level of service scenario. So throughout 2023, and I think maybe in 2024, we did hire consultants to do building condition audits, which is also known as a BCA. And really what those building condition audits included was the consultant went out, looked at the facility, and then recommended when like-for-like replacements and maintenance would be needed on those different components of each facility for our main facilities. There's some of the smaller facilities we didn't do that. But overall, what you're seeing here is on average, over the next 10 years, we would need to spend about $5.3 million to maintain levels of service. As you can see from the graph, we're only funding the building maintenance reserve at approximately $3.9 million. And then if you were to look at the overall life cycle average annual renewal need, that green line, it's actually at $10.2 million. So I think it's also important just to put those numbers into perspective for you guys. So some other considerations that we should be looking at. So if you look at some industry benchmarks, the Canadian Infrastructure Report Card, it did recommend that municipalities invest about 1.7% to 2.5% of their facility asset portfolio per year into the capital renewal each year. So if you applied those percentages to our total facility asset value, that equates to about $6.9 million to $10.1 million per year. Again, we currently invest $3.9 million per year, which equates to only about 1%. So I do think, maybe we don't need to be at that level that the BCAs are recommending, but I think what this does do is it really puts into perspective that it's clear we're not currently investing enough money into our facilities for their asset management needs later on down the line. And one of the things that we really want to highlight here is from a proposed level of service standpoint, the corporate net zero emissions plan. It's anticipated to be complete in Q2 of 2025. So that's really going to analyze all our major facilities and recommend, what projects we should undertake in order to hit whatever emissions targets council would like to see. So that's not going to be reflected in this iteration of the asset management plan, but it definitely will be incorporated in the future ones. And then if we go to fleet services, so again, I think it's important to note that fire emergency response is included in fleet along with all of the rolling stock and other vehicles. What we're showing in the model right now is the maintained level of service scenario. So right now, we're actually doing a pretty good job of funding our fleet and other equipment. And I think what we want to highlight for you guys here today is the proposed levels of service that would incorporate the green fleet strategy are still in development. So right now, the model just incorporates what it would cost to maintain levels of service. We're in pretty good shape right now, but we will incorporate the green fleet initiatives as part of the next iteration of the asset management plan in future years.
On to outdoor recreation. So that's our sports fields, whether cricket, baseball, basketball, whether the furniture within the parks, the lighting, the trails, the playgrounds, the play structures, tennis courts. Again, here the maintained level of service and proposed level of service remain consistent. They're equal. So the life cycle needs of these assets are $3.9 million average annual replacement needs. The 10-year requirement is currently 1.5, where the average annual funding is 2.0 million. This year we've done different condition assessment procedures. So hopefully we'll have more accurate data to reflect the conditions of these assets. And that'll lead to budgetary or more consistent budgeting and better modeling of these assets. Right. We're good there? Because then we get into each of these. Not a lot of money is being spent on sports fields. They last 40 years. But the average annual renewal need is about $400,000. And they stay pretty much consistent until year 9. Where a lot of them are in good to fair condition. The hard surface sports fields, the average annual requirement need for the life of that asset is about $200,000, and we're spending about $40,000 per year. The trails are about $2.2 million over the life of those assets. In the 10-year, the need is about $900,000. You might ask, why are we spending so much in year 10? That's not how we do business. We know that, but the model doesn't. We smooth things out and defer things out a little bit and bring things forward that need to be brought forward. The playgrounds, we're spending about $800,000 over the course of the life of that asset for the average annual requirement needs. The 10-year is about $400,000, and we're maintaining the condition of those assets over the course of the 10-year period. Splash pads, looks like we're doing one in year 7. But you're spending about $100,000 per year. So this has to do with the level of service for fire, library, indoor rec, and culture, and information technology. Instead of having the 4 smaller by, not by importance, by their portfolio, we put them all in one slide here. So the fire services, the 10-year average annual requirement need is $177,000. And over the life of those assets is $176,000, and there's no change in the level of service. The library services, the 10-year average annual requirement is $124,000. The life cycle average requirement need is about $160,000. There's an increase in the level of service here to be the 10-year average annual requirement need of being $140,000, and the overall life cycle average annual requirement need $190,000. Indoor rec and culture, the 10-year average annual requirement need for the current and proposed level of service remains the same at $98,000, and the life cycle average is $165,000. Information technology, there's a decrease in levels of service so the 10-year average annual requirement need of $508,000, and the life cycle average annual requirement need of $511,000 drops to respectively $422 and $454. So the fire services, whether it's your personal protective equipment, your respiratory equipment, rescue equipment, suppression equipment, the trucks and the fire halls are not included in here, as Kevin mentioned. Library services, this has the collections, the furniture, and the technology that are at these facilities, but not the facilities themselves. The indoor rec and culture, it has indoor exercise equipment, recreation, other, and public art, but not the gyms or the ice pads. The information technology, it's your laptops, your servers, your networking equipment. Any questions here? Oh. We're almost done. Maybe we wait.
Mr. Williamson, please get to the end of your presentation. We'll open up for questions. Thank you.
All right, so I know that was a lot of information. I hope you guys are still paying attention. But so really what we're going to see over the next couple slides is the proposed level of service summary. So, what you saw and what we're recommending, this is really what, these slides build upon all that. And then it'll show you the comparison between what it takes to maintain the level of service versus what it is we're proposing. So this probably looks familiar. This graph now shows the proposed level of service scenario. So as you can see, the funding, the red line here, stays the same at $21.5 million. But now the 10-year average annual need has dropped a lot closer to that red line. So you can see that the changes that we're recommending, they do actually result in some savings over the next 10 years. And then if you look at that green line, it's almost, I want to say about $6 million less than what it was before under the maintained level of service scenario. So there's only about a $2.3 million infrastructure gap to undertake the plan life cycle strategies over the next 10 years, $29.1 million to maintain the proposed levels of service over the next 10 years over the life cycle of the assets. And then what you see here again is that yellow line, but I think what's really important to understand from this graph is if we were to continue on with the 1% infrastructure levy, we can actually start saving money and putting money into reserves each year and building those reserves so that we're planning ahead for those, longer term renewal needs that are coming down the pipeline in 50, 60, 70 years from now. So I think this slide just does a good job of showing the comparison between the maintain and proposed level of service scenario, and you can actually see real time what the savings look like and what the need difference looks like. And what this shows is just the condition forecast. It doesn't change a huge amount, but there is going to be a degradation of the condition of our assets overall. I'll let Graham speak to this slide.
This is a little shock and awe of how assets could come, if we don't do things at the right time, do the right treatment at the right time. This is what could happen to our assets, whether, they pose risks to our community and to the reputation of the Ajax as a whole. Whether, the sidewalks uplifting because of freeze thaw, culverts that are collapsed and resulting in roads failing. I just want to preface that none of these pictures are from Ajax. I knew that question was coming. But the one of the streetlight pole, it's not far from here. It's from the city of Toronto. Whether, it has the rebar exposed, and I wouldn't want to be standing by that pole. Right, so it's just a little, but the pavement there for the road, it's very poor. That's not a poor paved surface. And there's just this is a citation for those pictures before. So the next steps, so we have to do these proposed levels of service to remain in compliance by July 1st, 2025. We're aiming for the presentation to go to council at the May 12th GGC. Going forward, we have to do annual reporting on the progress of implementing the asset management plan and the proposal of the service, and update these asset management plans at least every 5 years. And the asset management plan will support future budgeting and business planning. Thank you.
Okay, we have some questions, starting with Councillor Crawford. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Your Worship. Make no mistake, we have not stopped paying attention through this entire presentation. Thank you. My question is, we had a fire master plan and an IT master plan done not too long ago. So I'm curious, does the deficiencies or that was spoken here in this asset management plan reflect what was given to us in our master plans for IT and fire? Because I would hope that they align.
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, they do align. What you're seeing here is projections looking out and the needs over the next, however many years? 10 years? Yes.
The conditions were provided by the various service areas. So I would suspect that, I haven't read those documents, but they would be based upon the same data that we're using.
Okay, because we spent a lot of money on both of those master plans, so I want to make sure that that is relevant information that we were given, and that like this is not some kind of, add-on, right? That this is all okay. All right. I may have more questions, but that was the first one.
Okay, Councillor Lee, you are next.
Thank you, Chair. So I had a resident email me some questions that I have actually shared some of them. So if you go to page 6 of the presentation, it speaks to a 599 million replacement value for environmental. Last year, this number was 514. So why the delta?
The least of the factoring things is the assumptions of assets. So about 1% of that 17% that resident has cited is respective of acquiring new assets from 2023 to 2024. There was the inflationary of about 6%. So that represents, so now we're about 7% of the cost. And then there was data refinement. So the diameters of pipes and the lengths of pipes may have been adjusted, but the thing that had the most effect on the replacement value of that service area was using the costings that finance uses for PSAB purposes and keeping it consistent with the asset management plan. So that's about 9-10%.
Going forward, then, that's the standard we'll be using.
That's right.
So it won't be like, oh, we've changed the standard because of X, Y, Z, right? So this is kind of the standard, the baseline we're going forward. So if we get this report next year, for example, we would have the exact same, give or take 1 or 2 percentage points, the same reference of numbers, correct?
Unless the non-residential building CPI increases by 6% again, it will go up by 6%.
Okay. So that answers, I think that would answer the second question as well, where slide 7 shows that we had 2.47 billion in town assets are in fair condition. Last year, the number was 2.17 billion. So same kind of answer.
I would also like to include that when our consultants did it last year, they used a straight line depreciation line for these assets. So business practices uses a degradation curve where storm lines remaining in very good condition to about year 60, and then they fall off from 60 to 75 and good, and then between 75 to 85, they are in fair, and then 75 to 80, they go to poor, and then they fall off to very poor.
Okay.
But that speaks to a lot of those things with regards to the risk that the resident has addressed.
And then slide 10, it shows that 8.1 million gap. Is that to maintain status quo, or is there, no, that answers, no, that was the red line is existing, what we have. Yellow is the including our infrastructure levy, correct? That just want to clarify for the resident watching. 10, sorry, excuse me. And just going through the questions, those are all the questions. The resident had a few more, but I think we can answer them offline. That's correct?
Certainly, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Councillor Guys.
Thank you. Through you to staff, going back to the roads, because I know that's a really, really important issue for all of our residents. And it was my understanding, if memory serves me right, that, we have a list of roads and when they come of age to be resurfaced, and then our staff goes out and sort of double checks that, does an inspection and decides whether it has more life in it or not. Do we still do that?
So, through the chair to Regional Councillor Dyes, yes, we have annually sort of a third of our roads that are assessed in its entirety. So all roads are on a 3-year cycle for having their condition assessed by an external consultant that we use. We get a PQI, so no road segment is more than 3 years old in terms of the data that we currently have. We refine the capital project portfolio based on that information, but we're also actively doing inspections on a daily basis. So for example, in our operations group, we do have full-time patrollers that under the minimum maintenance standards are required to inspect all of our roads, identify deficiencies, so that will feed the program as well. So we've got, both at a staff level as well as from an overall condition assessment from an external consulting assessing our roads, have a number of inputs that are feeding the road resurfacing program. So we do implement it, and it is still very active as far as our budgeting and our day-to-day operations go.
And that would continue
Correct.
going forward. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay. Councillor Bauer.
Thank you, Mayor Collier. Thank you so much for spending the time to explain all of this to us. Really appreciate it. Is there a proposed level of service scenario that you did or could do that closes the gap between the red line and the dotted line completely? Or what? Or why did you choose, or why did you propose a scenario that doesn't fully close that gap?
Yeah, through the chair. So I think if you look at the proposed level of service scenario, at least over the next 10 years,
Yes,
you will see that we actually are able to start saving money.
yes.
We're not hitting that green line, but again, that's more of an aspirational line. I did do a calculation to show, like, if you were to continue with the 1% infrastructure levy, it's on my laptop. I can get you that number. My laptop's not working right now, so I apologize. But we could show you, like, that year that it at least hits the green line.
Sorry, not the green line, the dotted line, the 10-year line. Because you it's quite an impressive reduction from the existing annual average funding to the 10-year average annual. I'm looking at page 45. So it does significantly close that gap.
Yep.
Did you work on a scenario that would close it completely, or no?
So I guess, yeah, so to your point, so under the proposed level of service scenario where you're still seeing, like, the gap between the red line and the dotted line.
Yeah, so from 21.5
Yeah, so
to 23.8.
I guess we did not model that out. We potentially could. So I mean, if you were to say that we weren't going to increase the infrastructure levy any further, which is represented by that yellow line, because you can see, like, it is hitting the yellow line. The yellow line's hitting the dotted line within a couple of years, right? But if you were to not have any further infrastructure levy, what we would have to do is we'd have to, with your feedback, like, what areas could we further reduce levels of service, I guess.
Right, because and you're right, it does make the assumption that we will keep this infrastructure levy after 2026, which we may or may not, and it's good to see it there. But just wondering, what does it look like if we didn't do that? So that's just something that's not in the report. I was asking to see if you had that info to tell us, but.
Yeah, so, through the chair, I mean, if there is any areas where we could, based on, what residents have said to you guys, and if you have any ideas yourselves, if there are areas where you think, maybe we could reduce service levels, then we could, it would really depend on where we want to find that. But we haven't actually modeled that out at this point.
Okay, thank you. That was my question, Chair.
Okay. Councillor Tyler Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a point of clarity, on one of your slides, you had community centers and recreation centers. Is that one of the same? Because I know in the town of Ajax, we refer to Audley as the Audley Rec Center. I know it. I just wanted to, because I see you listed, needle in a haystack. I failed. I should have. Oh, there it just was. Yeah.
That's fine.
So you see recreation centers and community centers.
Yeah, you know what?
That's just
They should have been combined on that slide. That's
Okay.
a good point. Good catch. For the next one, we will.
That's all. Because
Yeah.
I thought, do we have those? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I think this was a holdover from when we worked with a consultant. It was more. We ultimately decided combine.
That's
the two.
fine.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, Councillor Henry.
And that just proves we were paying attention. There you go. So going on to slide 17, back to slide 17 again in the roads. And I don't know, I want to ask a question of staff, if I can, through the chair, with regards to the poor condition definition. And do we allow our roads currently to get into that? We do not, correct? Into that category of the 20 to 40. Can I ask that of, who would I ask? Director Meredith?
Through the chair to Councillor Henry, There have been times where our roads have been allowed to degrade to the point where they would be into the poor category, below a 35, for example. There are sometimes, I guess what I would say, 35 from a staff perspective, which is why we're recommending it for local roads, in our minds is still a very good quality road that residents can safely drive upon without noticeably feeling a deterioration in the road conditions. There are times where if a road did degrade below 30% and got down into a lower number, sometimes a municipality will make a decision to allow that road to continue to degrade, knowing that you're going to have to do a full road reconstruction. So you'd still monitor the road, you'd still assess it, but you wouldn't reconstruct it until it was absolutely needed. So sometimes that is a strategic approach that municipalities will take with respect to reconstruction. We're not proposing that. We're proposing in what the level of service that is being proposed with respect to roads at all classes, from collectors to arterials to locals, is to fund it to what we believe is an appropriate standard that would not have the roads degrade below a certain point, but at the same time provide a high level of service to our residents.
And Director Meredith, when we get down to this grade, this poor 20 to 40, does it impact the cycling infrastructure on those local roads?
Typically, the cycling lanes are on collector or arterial roads. They're not generally on local roads. So they would have a higher PQI that would be applied, but cycling lanes are part of the transportation assets that we would look at. So they will have a higher level of service where there is a cycle lane because, as I said, they are primarily on collector and arterial roads.
But we do have those, excuse me, I just want to clarify. We do have local roads where we've put in those little animal patterns, trail markers, stencils, thank you, that take you from one path to another. And those are local roads. So that's more the infrastructure that I'm referring to. Would that be affected? Like when you're going from one trail to another and you're using that stencil marker system?
I'm trying to visualize sort of where these stencils are on local roads. They are primarily on the trail system, but if there is, I know I'm trying to visualize.
And my colleagues have filled in the gap for me, thank you, as I screamed it out. So there's a lot of them, as you can see by the screams that come at you. So will that be affected?
The stencil and the line painting for our cycle lanes.
Not the stencil itself, the actual quality of the road for the cyclists. I'm not worried about if the stencils aren't looking good. I just want for all the folks listening at home, that's not my concern. My concern is the actual road itself, allowing it to get into a poorer shape, and if it will still be a smooth cycling infrastructure.
It will still be a smooth cycling piece of infrastructure.
Okay, that's all I needed to hear from you. Thank you.
Okay, that exhausts the speakers list. We just get back to the agenda.
Mr. Mayor, do you mind 1 second?
Yes, go ahead, Shane.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I just wanted to make a couple of comments. I know this was a lot of information that was presented to you today, and in some cases, pardon? Yes, and we appreciate that. Obviously, a very, very important subject that was brought forward. The Ontario government, as you heard, requires that we do all this analysis and report it out to council so that council's aware. And the purpose of the presentation is to advise council of our current condition of all of our infrastructure assets and the funding gap that exists. And yes, the funding gap exists in every municipality. And the purpose of this analysis and the information is to show you that, A, we need to be taking steps to be able to put money away in various ways, either by through infrastructure levies, grants, and so on, or by reducing levels of service. And I'll talk about that in a second. as was presented today. The question was raised actually about the respect to how do we fund it, and yes, it's true that the infrastructure levy is funded by the residents. All of these assets are owned by the residents, but it is incumbent upon us, and we will make recommendations to you, as you heard today, about other ways to close that gap, such as reducing the level of service, or through grants, or other non-tax revenue means, such as our investment income. And this kind of relates back to one of the subject that we spoke about last week and that we'll be talking about later today, about how important it is, and why we're emphasizing this, how important it is to ensure that all of our assets are performing to their potential, so that we have that non-tax revenue to be able to use for things like this, which is absolutely our mandate. Thank you very much.
Okay, I see Councillor Crawford has a question.
Thank you. How many other municipalities in Durham Region have a infrastructure levy? I know we were I think we were first, perhaps, maybe?
Through the chair, in Durham, definitely Scugog. So I implemented it there and they've continued on that road. And I don't believe that any other municipality actually identifies it separately on their tax bill. It could be built in.
As a reserve or whatever?
In Durham, right, yes.
Okay, okay.
Through you, Mr. Chair, a number of other municipalities do. I was looking it up, actually. Mississauga implemented a 5%. I think Guelph also has one. There's a number of them, but we can provide that information to you.
Yep, thank you.
Okay, seeing, hearing no others in the speakers list. Thank you, Mr. Williamson and staff, for your work and your presentation, and to all of our senior management team who have reviewed all of this. Looking at the agenda, we have a confirming bylaw. So I'm just going to choose to go by ward again. Ward 1, moved by Councillor Crawford, second by Councillor Tyler Morin, that the confirming bylaw, that the actions of council at the special meeting held on the 24th day of March and in respect to each motion and resolution which weren't done be passed. Questions or comments on the confirming bylaw? Okay, not seeing anybody in the speaker list, please vote. Thank you, that carries. And finally, moved by Councillor Lee, second by Councillor Henry, that this meeting be adjourned. Those in favor? That carries. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you at the council meeting at 1 o'clock.